Attachment whole topic revision. So attachment can be broken down into attachment, so that's our caregiver interaction stages, and our animal studies, our explanations of attachment, so learning theory and Bowlby's monotropic theory, the strange situation and cultural variations, deprivation, and how attachment links to adult relationships. Caregiver interactions. Now the spec requires you to understand reciprocity and interactional synchrony. Reciprocity is a two-way process. So it's the responding and reacting to the needs of each other. So here the caregiver reacts and responds to signals given by the baby. So smiling back when they smile, picking them up and giving them a cuddle when they cry. If the baby puts their arms up for a cuddle, the mum or dad responds. Interactional synchrony is the mirroring of each other. They interact in a way so they copy and imitate one another. So if the mother or father tilts their head, the baby does the same. Now generally, a lot of the research into interactions have used control procedures, so they're usually filmed from multiple angles, and therefore it increases the reliability of the observation and of the results. There is real-world applications of this research. So 10-minute parent-child interaction therapy improves the interactional synchronicity in 20 low-income mothers and their preschool infants, which could in turn have an impact on our economy, could help these children grow up to be securely attached, therefore be better at forming friends and socialising in the future. Generally, it's hard to know what is actually happening during mother-infant interaction because it's generally changes in expression and hand movements that are being recorded. So really, are we observing interaction? It's really socially sensitive. So it suggests that children may be disadvantaged by particular child rearing practices, or whether a parent doesn't meet this interactional synchronicity or reciprocity. Observations also don't tell us the purpose of these interactions, merely that they happen. Stages of attachment. So we need to be aware of the 4 stages. So they're asocial, indiscriminate, specific, and multiple. Asocial was within the first few weeks of a life. So the baby's behaviour both towards objects and humans seems to be quite similar. However, they do seem to show a preference by a familiar adult, so they seem to be easily calmed by them. The indiscriminate stage, that is between 2 and 7 months. So they display more social behaviour and they show a preference for people rather than objects. Again, they recognise and prefer familiar adults, but they don't show stranger or separation anxiety. So they're not wary of a stranger, nor do they seem that concerned when a person leaves the room. So attachment is called indiscriminate because it is the same towards all. Specific attachment is around about 7 months. So stranger anxiety and separation anxiety happens in particular to one particular adult. They form an attachment figure with a primary attachment figure. In most cases, that is the mother. Multiple attachments happen by a year, so secondary attachment to other adults form within this time. Generally, it will be with the father, parents, key workers, grandparents. So 29% of babies within Schaefer-Emerson's study had formed multiple attachments within a month of forming their primary specific attachment. So we can use Schaefer and Emerson's research study either as AO1 or AO2. If we merely describe the study, it will be AO1. If we go on to say, however, supporting research by Schaefer and Emerson demonstrates there are stages of attachment, it becomes AO3. So they wanted to investigate the stages of attachments in infants. So they observed 60 babies from Glasgow, mainly from working class families. The babies and their mothers were visited at home every month for a year, and then at 18 months. Separation anxiety was measured by asking the mothers how they felt or how the children's behaviour was when they left the room. Stranger anxiety was again asked the mother questions about their children's anxiety to unfamiliar adults. They found that 50% of babies showed separation anxiety between the ages of 25 to 32 weeks, and they showed a specific attachment, usually with the mother. They concluded that attachment tended to be the caregiver who was most interactive and sensitive, so due to reciprocity, and it was not necessarily the person they spent the most time with. So it has high internal validity due to the observations being made by the parents and reporting it to the researchers. It was a longitudinal study, which means that any individual differences between participants are removed, which increases the validity of the research. However, the description of the asocial stage is saying that babies are not social at that time. However, it could be just because they're immobile, we're not measuring them being social. Bowlby states that most babies form an attachment to a single caregiver before they are able to form multiple attachments. However, it doesn't seem to necessarily be true in collectivist cultures where families work together. So it could be that actually children do form multiple attachments before single. Also, by measuring stranger anxiety, is it really measuring attachment to a caregiver? Because sometimes babies or children will become distressed when a playmate leaves the room. It doesn't mean they necessarily have a true attachment to that figure. So animal studies. You need to know about Lorenz and Harlow. So Lorenz took baby geese to see whether they would imprint on the first thing they saw. So he randomly divided 12 grey lag goose eggs. Half of them hatched with the mother, so that was the first thing that they would see. The other half hatched in an incubator, and the first thing they saw was Lorenz. He then mixed them up, the goslings, so all 12 went back into a group to see who they would follow. Those that were born or hatched within the incubator followed Lorenz, whereas the control group, those that hatched with the mother, followed the mother. Also, Lorenz discovered that imprinting was between 13 to 16 hours. He concluded that this critical period of imprinting was fast and automatic, and if it didn't happen within this time, they wouldn't attach to a mother figure. Harlow wanted to see whether baby monkeys would prefer a source of food or a source of comfort. So he used a lab experiment. Rhesus monkeys were raised in isolation. They had 2 surrogate mothers. One was made of a wire mesh, and it contained a feeding bottle, so it was providing food. The other was made of cloth, but didn't contain any food, but it provided comfort. They spent most of the time clinging to the comfort of the cloth mother, and they only went to the wire surrogate when they needed to feed. So it seemed that the surrogate cloth mother gave them comfort. They also found that when they grew up, they showed signs of social and emotional disturbance, and particularly the females were bad mothers and often violent towards their offspring. So it concluded that infant monkeys formed more of an attachment to the figure that provided comfort rather than food, and growing up in isolation affects their development. Okay, remember this fact for later on. Harlow's research was supported by Schaefer and Emerson's findings that infants were not necessarily most attached to the person that fed them. Harlow and Zimmerman adapted the Rhesus monkey study and added a fearful stimulus, so a mechanical toy that would frighten the monkey. And again, they ran for the cloth mother, so it supports the idea that they go to the comfort. It's hard to generalise the findings to humans, so we need to be careful of extrapolation. Humans are a lot more complex than animals, so we might not necessarily be able to generalise the findings. Also, there are ethical issues with animal research. The animals were not able to give consent, and in Harlow's research, the animals were clearly distressed during the research. So learning theory. So we have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning based on Pavlov's research. So this is the idea that attachment has formed by association. Okay. So generally we're going to use the mother as the attachment in this case. So the mother begins as a neutral stimulus. She produces no response. Okay. The food is a unconditioned stimulus that produces pleasure. So it produces the unconditioned response. Food makes the baby feel happy. So the mother feeds the baby, and therefore the pairing of the mother and food begins to happen. So the child associates the mother with this pleasure from being fed. Therefore, the mother becomes this conditioned stimulus that produces the feeling of pleasure, the conditioned response, resulting in an attachment being formed. Operant conditioning also comes into this. So positive reinforcement. So babies cry for comfort. The crying leads to a response from the caregiver, so they're being rewarded. Negative reinforcement, generally for the parent. So if the baby is crying, the caregiver picks them up, the crying stops, that removal of that unpleasant stimulus has happened, so they're being negatively reinforced. Drive reduction is also an important part. So hunger is a primary drive. We are motivated to eat and reduce the hunger drive. Attachment is a secondary drive that is learnt through association. So it's suggested that the caregiver provides food, and that primary drive of hunger becomes generalised to them. Okay, evaluation. Lorenz, the geese didn't imprint. The geese's imprintings, maintained to the first thing they saw, regardless of who fed them. And Harlow's monkeys goes against this because they attach to the comfort mother rather than the one that gave them food. Again, Schaefer and Emerson showed that babies of a primary attachment was not necessarily with the person that fed them. And also research has shown that quality of attachment is associated rather than those that feed them. So the best quality of attachments are with caregivers who pick up on the infant signals, not necessarily the ones that feed them. Okay, Bowlby's theory. This is completely different. Bowlby's monotropic theory. Don't get it confused with Bowlby's maternal deprivation. Attachment isn't learnt. Bowlby believes it has evolved and it is innate. Attachment has happened through natural selection, and it happens because attachments increase the child's chances of survival. So remember the acronym of ASMIC. So it's adaptive. Children have an innate drive to become attached. As I said, it's adaptive because it increases survival and later reproductive success. Social releases. Babies are born with certain characteristics that elicit or create a caregiver response. So it could be smiling and crying. It means that we want to look after them. Critical period. So this is the idea that there is a certain time period for attachment to take place. So generally about 2.5 years. After that time, Bowlby suggests that it is not possible or is difficult to form an attachment at this time point. Monotropy, so there's one attachment, one special attachment that he calls monotropy, so they form a special attachment to someone. Internal working model. So they develop this working model, this framework, this blueprint for how they expect all future relationships to be, and continuity hypothesis. So early attachments will affect later behaviour. So the type of attachment that we have as a child will carry on throughout adult life. Okay, so the strengths to it, that primary attachment figures who were told to ignore their baby's social releases cause their babies to get very distressed, so it shows the importance of that interaction. There's also support for the internal working model as it predicts future patterns. So Bailey found that those with poor attachment to their own parents were more likely to have poorly attached children themselves. Alternative explanation, so it could be temperament that is important in the development than this adaptive trait. And monotropic is socially sensitive. It's implicating the mother's lifestyle. So the mother may feel that they have to stay at home to be the main caregiver rather than going back to work and seeking a career. Strange situation. So they wanted to assess and measure the quality of attachment. 100 middle-class American infants and their mothers took part in the study. It was a controlled observation, 8 predetermined sessions or stages, and each of them lasted 3 minutes, except the first stage. Stage 1, mother and child enter the room. Stage 2, the child explores. Stage 3, the stranger enters and attempts to interact with the child. Stage 4, the mother leaves while the stranger is present. Stage 5, the mother enters and the stranger leaves. Stage 6, the mother leaves. Stage 7, stranger returns. Stage 8, mother returns and interacts with the child. Okay, during these, the key focus was on stranger anxiety, so how the infants responded to the stranger. Separation anxiety, so how they responded when their caregiver left the room. And the reunion behaviour, how they responded when the mother came back. General findings: that most infants were securely attached. The least type of attachment was insecure resistant, and 22% were insecure avoidant. So there seemed to be an association between the mother's behaviour and the infant's attachment types, and most of North American children were described as securely attached. So the findings can be easily replicated as it's a straightforward method to follow. So numerous studies have been conducted and show very similar findings, so it increases the reliability. It's a controlled observation, so high internal validity. The room is kept the same, the toys are kept the same, each of the stages the same amount of time. It's culturally biased. It was developed and carried out in the US, so it's ethnocentric and might not apply to other cultures. We have this idea of imposed ethic. So the types of attachment are based on the values and norms of American children and what they believe is a healthy attachment type. So judging other countries by that may have imposed ethic. And observer effects. The mums knew they were being observed, so therefore they may have changed their behaviour. So do we have a valid method of measuring attachment type? The types of attachment are secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant. So a securely attached child will happily explore the environment. They have a secure base with their mother, but they do come back to the mother in time to time. They show moderate separation anxiety and stranger anxiety, and they are quickly comforted by the mother on reunion. So yes, they do get upset when the mother leaves, but they're quickly comforted. Okay, so think of them as in the middle. Insecure avoidant and insecure resistant are the extreme behaviours at the opposite end of the spectrum or continuum. So an avoidant child explores freely, but they show little separation anxiety, so they don't really seem to mind that the mum has left, and they don't require comfort at the reunion stage. Whereas a resistant child doesn't have that secure base. They want to be close to the mother. They fear that she will leave. They explore less. They show considerable stranger and separation anxiety, so they get very distressed, and they resist the comfort when their mum comes back, so they find it very hard to be settled by the mother at the reunion stage. Cultural variations. So Van Isendorn and Kronenberg wanted to see whether attachment type was consistent across different cultures. So they used a meta-analysis, which is a review of lots of different research. So 32 studies of the attachment where the strain situation had been used, 8 different countries, 15 were in the US, and studies for results from 1,990 children. So they found the most common classification was securely attached. Individualistic cultures, rates of insecure resistant attachment were similar to the original sample of Ainsworth's research. But it was not true for collectivist. Collectivist cultures, the rates were above 25%. So there were rates of insecure avoidant attachments were reduced. So there does seem to be cultural differences in the distribution of insecure attachment. So remember, in individualistic cultures, insecure resistant was the most common. However, in collectivist cultures, insecure avoidant was the most common insecure attachment type. Securely attached was still the most common across all cultures. So therefore, we can say there are cultural variations in the insecure attachment type. However, it was found that there was greater variation within countries or cultures than between cultures. So, strength of it was a very large sample size, so therefore that increases the internal validity because it reduces any bias in the methodology. However, only 5 out of the 32 studies were carried out in non-Western cultures, so it would be unsafe to generalise to all collective cultures. Again, we have this idea of imposed ethic. We're still using the American norms and values of what a securely attached child is, what a healthy child is, to judge other cultures. Also, there's a weakness in the strain situation. So the strain situation might actually be measuring temperament, so that personality trait, rather than attachment style. And within countries, there are different cultures. So it was found that attachment types in urban Tokyo are similar to Western society, whereas rural samples in Japan were more likely to be insecure resistant. So there was greater variations within Japan in urban and rural areas. So comparison between countries may actually have little meaning. Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So Bowlby said that continued emotional care from the mother is essential. Bowlby believed that continual emotional care is necessary for a normal emotional and intellectual development. Separation from the mother may lead to maternal deprivation. It is different to deprivation. So deprivation is when they lose emotional care as a result of separation. Deprivation can be avoided if an alternative care is offered. So separation doesn't necessarily always cause deprivation, but if a successful alternative isn't found, then it can do. He said there's a critical period of 30 months. So if the child is separated from the mother after the age of before 30 months and a substitute isn't found, then it'll be very difficult for them to form an attachment at this stage. It can impact on the intellectual development of the child. So it's found that children of maternal deprivation have a lower IQ. Okay. Goldfarb found that lower IQ in children from institutions compared to those that have been fostered, so they've had that successful emotional substitute. Also, it can be linked to emotional development, in particular affectionless psychopathy. So that is where they have an inability to experience guilt or strong emotions from others. It prevents a person from developing normal attachments and relationships, and generally is associated with criminality. So he carried out a study called the 44 Thieves. It's a case study were completed on the backgrounds of 44 adolescents who had been referred to a clinic where Bowlby worked because they'd been stealing. There was a control group of 44 emotionally disturbed adolescents who didn't steal. So 17 of the thieves had experienced frequent separations from their mothers before the age of 2. compared to 2 within the control group. 14 of the thieves were diagnosed as affectionist psychopaths, and 12 of that 14 had experienced separation with their mothers. So he concluded that depriving a child of the main caregiver has harmful long-term effects. So, strengths. Orphanage children who were socially and maternally deprived were later less intellectually and socially developed, so we've got supporting evidence. We also have supporting evidence from rats. So when they separated the baby rats from their mother, it had permanent effects on their social development. However, we need to be careful when generalising these findings to humans. Lewis replicated the 44 thieves studies by looking at 500 young people, and he found that prolonged maternal deprivation did not predict criminality or difficulty forming close relationships. So we have that contradictory evidence. The case study of the Czech twins doesn't support this idea of critical period. So they were found at the age of 18 months, so after his critical period, but they fully recovered. He said that the thieves' behaviour was linked to maternal deprivation, but it could be other factors. We can't say it necessarily established cause and effect. So it could be the poverty that they grew up in. It could be a third variable that Bowlby hasn't measured. So we need to be careful when generalising and applying his findings. Rutter also argues that severe long-term damage is more likely to be the result of privation rather than deprivation. So it could be that they'd never formed an attachment in the first place. So it could be that Bowlby is confusing deprivation with privation, so they never had that attachment figure rather than being separated. So Romanian orphanages, we need to look at the effects of institutionalisation. So generally they are physically underdeveloped. So there has actually been a link between deprivation and dwarfism. They are intellectually underfunctioning. So they score poorly on intelligence tests. They have disinhibited attachment, so it's a form of insecure attachment. They are overly friendly with strangers and they attention seek. And poor parenting themselves, particularly women who go on to have their own offspring, will find it difficult to be a parent themselves. So Rutter's Romanian orphan study. The researchers followed a group of 165 Romanian orphans who experienced poor conditions before they were adopted in Britain. It was a longitudinal study, so they were assessed at the ages of 4, 6, 11 and 15 years. They were assessed in terms of their physical, cognitive and emotional development. They also had a control group of 52 adopted British children. So half the orphans showed mental retardation when they came to the UK. However, by the age of 11, recovery rates were related to the age at which they were adopted. So those that were adopted before 6 months had a mean IQ of 102. Those adopted between 6 months and 2 years had a mean IQ of 86. Those that were adopted after the age of 2 had a mean IQ of 77. The frequency of disinhibited attachment also related to the age of adoption. It was particularly apparent in children adopted after they were 6 months old, so they were very clingy, they were attention seeking and very indiscriminate towards strangers, so they were friendly towards strangers. However, it was rare in children adopted before the age of 6 months. So these findings support that there is a sensitive critical period in the development of attachment. So if you are deprived of forming that attachment, so you have that privation before the age of 6 months, there are long-lasting effects. So the research used to improve the lives of children in care, so in particular the Romanian orphans, so it's been used to indicate care homes and foster homes for children. It is a longitudinal study, so which increases the internal validity of the finding. It's unlikely that there are going to be any individual differences between the participants because there is the same child being assessed at different stages, so we can see the long-term effects. it's only one factor. Deprivation is only one factor. They could have also experienced poor physical conditions, and the lack of the cognitive stimulus could have impacted on their development rather than having deprivation. Okay, there are individual differences. So Russia suggests that some children may have got special attention within the institute, so they could have been more social, they smiled more, so they got different experiences. Also, institutionalization may just be slow development. So development may continue beyond the time period, so it might not be as irreversible as the research first suggests. So some children of institutionalization do go on to develop good quality emotional development. We need to know about the influence of early attachment on adult behaviour. So Bowlby's internal working model looked at how our childhood attachments influence later relationships. Primary attachment quality is positively correlated with quality of later relationships, and our interaction with our primary caregiver teaches us how we expect future relationships to be. So our first attachment is a template. It forms a framework of what we expect our future relationships to be. So our internal working model is a result of this first attachment. Our good experiences indicate good relationship expectations. So if we have experienced a loving relationship, we expect all future relationships to be good, to seek out functional relationships, to behave functionally with it in them. Bad experiences lead to bad expectations. So we may struggle to form future relationships in the first place, or may not behave appropriately within them if we have had bad experiences with our first attachment. Secure infants form better friendships and are less likely to bully. So securely attached children tend to go on to form the best quality childhood friendships. Also, they are less likely to be involved in bullying and be the victims of bullying. Insecure avoidants are most likely to be picked on and to be bullied, so to be the victims of bullying, whereas insecure resistant were most likely to bully other children. It also affects parenting. People base their parenting style on their internal working model. So attachment types tend to be based on what they have experienced. So Harlow found that rhesus monkeys that were removed from their mother had difficulties caring for their own offspring. It was also found true for women that were raised in institutes. They found it difficult to act as parents to their offspring. Okay, we've got some research. So the love quiz, they wanted to see whether early attachment affects romantic relationships. So 205 men and 415 women responded to a quiz placed into an American newspaper, asking about their attachment experiences, attachment in childhood, and attitude toward love. Most of the respondents were securely attached. Their attachment type reflected their romantic relationships. So securely attached individuals were most likely to have good and longer lasting romantic relationships. Avoidance tended to be the most jealous and fear intimacy. So they concluded that attachment type as a child is reflected in romantic relationships later on in life. Simpson et al. Supports Hazen and Shaver's findings. So they assessed a securely attached at 1 year of age, were then rated as being more socially competent as children, being closer to their friends, having emotionally attachments to their romantic partners later on. However, correlation doesn't seem to be stable. So 27 samples, infants were assessed in infancy and then as adults, and correlations ranged from 0.5 to as low as 0.1, so it's not consistent. We can't establish cause and effect. Both attachment type and later love style type could be down to innate temperament rather than attachment type influencing. So there could be that third variable of that personality trait. It's overly deterministic. So some studies have found that insecurely attached children will go on to have happy relationships in adulthood. And again, there's an alternative explanation. So adult attachment patterns may be the result of the current relationship that they are in rather than early individual attachment. So rather than adult attachment type causing the adult's secure relationship, it is the qualities of their relationship that is causing the secure attachment.